In this video, we're going to look inside the results objects and check if we've got any records. If we do have records, then we're going to print the trips on our page. If we don't have any records, then we're just going to show an error message. All right. So let's first check if the number of rows inside the results objects is 0. So the number of rows can be obtained using the MySQLi number of rows function, which takes our results objects as a parameter. So if this is equal to 0, then we're going to show a message to our user saying something like there are no journeys matching your search. Okay, so that's what you get if you look for a trip that doesn't match anything. Okay, all right, so we're going to style this div by giving it a couple of classes. So let's give it an alert and alert info class to get this nice blue color. Okay, and also to make the text centered, I'm going to add another class that we can style. I'm going to call it no results. And if we go to our CSS file, styling.css. Okay, so let's select the class using its ID. And so to center the text, we're going to use the text align property and it set it to center. Okay, so let's save. Let's go back to our search file. Okay, so now if we don't find any records, we show this message and then we can just exit the code using the exit keyword. All right, so now if we get there, this means that we found records inside our results objects. So first of all, we're going to print this div. Okay, so let's echo a div saying from departure to destination. Okay, so you've got a problem there in the final file. We're showing from departure to departure instead of the destination. Okay, I'm just going to pause the video quickly and amend that. All right, so that looks better, from departure to destination. So we're going to use the departure and destination variables, which we defined right at the top. So we're going to have from departure to destination. Okay, so let's style our div by giving it a couple of classes. So again, I'm going to go for alerts and alerts info. Okay, let's save. All right, now we're going to create a div where we're going to place the results. All right, so first I'm going to echo the beginning of the div. And then we're going to have all the trips inside the div, and then we're going to close our div right at the end, like that. Okay, so let's give our div an ID that we're going to refer to in the JavaScript file, because once the AJAX call is successful, we're going to send data back to the JavaScript file, and we're going to get all the data and place it inside that div. So we're going to refer to this div using its ID. So I'm going to call it search results. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to cycle through all the trips that we'll find inside the results objects. And for each row, we're going to have one trip. Then we're just going to print that trip. So we're going to have various data that we need to retrieve for every single trip. That includes details about the trip itself and then details about the driver. So for the trip, we're going to need things like the departure, destination, date and time, frequency, and so on. And for the user, we're going to need the first name of the user, the picture, phone number, comments, okay, and so on. So to cycle through the trips, we're going to have a while loop, okay? So inside the while loop, we're going to have every time a row, okay, or a variable row, where we're going to store one record. So to get one record, we're going to use the function MySQLi fetch array. So again, this function takes a couple of parameters, our result object, and we can add an extra parameter if we want. So since I want an associative array, I'm going to use again MySQLi associative, like that. So inside the while loop, we're going to retrieve all details that we want, and then we're going to use those details to print our trips. So let's get the trip details. We've already gone through a similar process in the trips page, okay, because we had to retrieve details about different trips like departure, destination, and so on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the get trips file. Okay. And then I'm going to copy the section where we get all these details. Okay. Frequency, then departure, destination, price, seats available. We don't need the trip ID for now. So let's get those details and copy them right there. Okay, so first of all, we checked the frequency. So if the trip was not regular, then our frequency was set to a one-off journey. And then we got the time, date and time. And then if the trip was regular, then it was a different story. Okay. All right, now let's just add a trip, okay, in my trips between Bedford and London and make it a one-off trip. Okay, so if I go back to the search page and look again for Bedford to London, then we're going to have an extra result there. Okay, that's the one. So for one-off trips, we have a date and time. So when we want to display a trip like this, we need to make sure that the date is in the future. All right. So in that case, we're going to need to have an extra check. So this is for one-off journeys. Okay, now we're going to check the dates and make sure that the date is in the past. So first of all, we're going to get the dates and store it inside a variable. I'm going to call it source. So to get the date, it's going to be row date. All right. Also, we're going to get today's date. So I'm going to define another variable. I'm going to call it today. And we're going to use the date function to get today's date. All right. So we want these two to have the same format to be able to compare them later. So first of all, when we stored, or when the user was adding a date using the add trip form, the format they used was something like this. If you remember. So this means we've got the weekday space followed by the day and then the month and then the year. All right, this is still not enough. Okay, so in order for PHP to be able to manipulate these two dates, it's still not enough. So what we're going to do, we're going to pass these two dates using a function or a method that is called create from format. All right, so this method is inside a class datetime. All right, so let's start with the trip date. So we're going to define a variable. I'm going to call it trip date. All right, so we're going to use the class datetime, and then we're going to use something that we call a scope resolution operator to use the method that we want inside datetime. So this operator is a double colon. Okay, if you want to know more about it, just go to PHP double colon operator, and then it will give you some details about it. Usually it's used to access static or constant as well as overridden properties of methods and of a class. Okay, so in our case, we need to use a double colon in order for us to get to the create from format. So the class or the method is called create from format. It's going to take a couple of parameters. So the first parameter is the format that we want. In our case, we want something like this. And the second parameter is our date. We're going to do the same thing for today's date, because we want the same format to be able to compare them. So we're going to call this one today's date, and it's going to take as a parameter the format and the today variable. All right, so now we are ready to compare that date with that date. So if the trip date is in the past, then we're not going to go through the rest of the code. We will just continue the loop. So we're just going to move to the next record, right? So let's do this. So if the trip date is less than today's date, meaning that the trip date is in the past, then we are just gonna move to the next record using the continue keyword. So when you use continue inside a loop, that means just continue to the next one. Okay. So our loop is actually cycling through the different records. Okay, it's fetching inside our results objects. So every time it's going to fetch one record, one line, one row. And if we use the continue word, that means just go to the next record. All right. All right. So now let's have a quick look at this code here. There is another way of doing this. Okay. So if you notice, we are actually using the same code 7 times. And every time what we're doing, we're just pushing into this array one value. So let's pick that statement and write it there. So basically what we're doing, we defined an array. Okay, let's do that again. And then every time we just checked something. Okay, we checked the value of the element of key that day or weekday, and if it was equal to 1, then we pushed into the array an extra value. Okay, so let's call this a variable value for now. So value is one of those values. Okay, and the checks are actually linked to these keys. Okay, so an easy way of doing this is by defining an associative array with these keys and those values. And then we're going to loop through that array. And if the check is okay, we're going to push the value inside the array. So let's start with the associative array first. So I'm going to call this weekdays. Okay, you can still use the old code. It's fine, but we're just going to optimize it. So as I said, the keys are going to be those and the values are going to be those. So the first one is going to be Monday. That's the key, and the value is going to be that one. Okay. And then we're going to do the same thing for Tuesday. So I'm going to pause the video and do the rest. All right, now we're going to cycle through the array using the for each keyword. So that's how we cycle through an associative array. So we need the array. Okay, and then we're going to use as key value. Okay, and then we're going to write the code that we want to execute. In our case, we want to push into the array. Okay, that value if a condition is verified. So the condition is going to be if that is equal to 1, and we're going to replace that using the key. Okay. So now we can just delete this code. And we have a more optimized and shorter code. Okay, so let's save this. All right, so in the next video, we're going to get the user details so that we can show their first name, profile picture, and so on.